Have you ever felt like your world was perfect, only for it to shatter into a million pieces in the blink of an eye? You trust people, family, your spouse, even the priest who marries you because you believe in their integrity, their commitment to you. But what if the very people you thought you could rely on the most turned out to be the ones who hurt you in the deepest, most unimaginable way? I used to think that the most shocking thing that could happen to me would be a simple betrayal, maybe a minor mistake. But what I discovered, it was far worse. My husband wasn't just unfaithful. He was in a forbidden relationship with the very priest who had married us, someone I trusted with my deepest, most sacred vows. And trust me, finding this out wasn't just a heartbreak. It was a devastating secret that ripped apart everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and even faith. Now let me ask you, how would you handle that? What would you do if the person who helped build your life, your marriage, turned out to be the one who tore it down? It's a moral dilemma like no other, and I'm sharing every detail, every twist, and every emotional roller coaster I went through. Stick with me till the end of this video because you're going to want to hear this, and trust me, you'll want to share your thoughts on this. Would you forgive them or would you walk away? Drop a comment below and tell me. How would you respond to a shocking revelation like this? And don't forget to follow and like the video if this hits close to home. Let's dive in. I remember the day I married my husband like it was yesterday, except looking back it feels like that day was a different lifetime. It was supposed to be the beginning of forever. The flowers, the vows, the soft music echoing through the church. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of. And standing beside me in that moment was the person I believed I could trust above all others. My husband. The man I loved with every fiber of my being. The one I imagined growing old with, building a family, facing life's ups and downs. We'd promised each other, through thick and thin, till death do us part. Those words meant everything to me. But there was another person in that moment. Someone who had a role far more significant than anyone could have ever expected. The priest who married us. The man who wasn't just a stranger leading us through the ritual, but someone who had become a trusted part of our lives. He guided us, offering counsel and support whenever we needed it. I even thought of him as a mentor, someone I could always turn to for advice and guidance. I admired him in ways that now seem almost naive, but at the time I believed everything he said and did was rooted in faith and integrity. What if I told you that everything I thought I knew about trust, love, and faith would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined? Sometimes life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you when you least expect it. It's strange how the people you trust most, the ones you hold closest to your heart, can be the ones who betray you in ways that seem impossible. And just when you think you have everything figured out, the world you've built begins to crumble. Slowly at first, like a whisper of something you can't quite hear. The cracks are small, unnoticeable, until it all shatters at once, leaving you stunned, gasping for breath. But for now, all I can do is ask myself, could I have ever predicted the unimaginable turn my life was about to take? When we first got married, everything felt perfect. I'm talking about the kind of perfect that seems like it's straight out of a fairy tale. Those early days where everything is new, exciting, and full of possibilities. I remember the way my husband would look at me when we talked about our future, the way his eyes sparkled when he spoke about our dreams. It was as if nothing could touch us, as if we had this rare bond that would withstand anything life threw our way. And maybe, just maybe, we had something that was stronger than most because we had faith. Our shared faith kept us grounded. It was the center of our relationship, the thing that bound us together when everything else felt chaotic. We leaned into each other, yes, but we also leaned into the faith we shared. We prayed together, attended services together, and even sought advice from the priest who married us when we faced challenges. He wasn't just there for our ceremony. He became a figure in our lives, someone we trusted wholeheartedly. My husband, with his unwavering belief, would often say, "We have the foundation to withstand anything. As long as we're together, and with God's guidance, nothing can break us." At the time it was easy to believe him. Everything felt aligned. I remember the little moments that defined our early marriage. Lazy Sunday mornings when we'd sit at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, dreaming about our future children, the house we'd build, and the life we'd create. There was a certain rhythm to our days, a sense of peace I thought would never end. We had an unspoken understanding that everything was as it should be. And whenever there was uncertainty, there was always the priest. His wisdom, his calmness made us feel secure. He was a constant in a world that sometimes felt unpredictable. Looking back, I now see those moments through a different lens. What I thought was a flawless partnership was, in reality, a web of secrets and unspoken doubts. But in those early days, it was also easy to believe in the dream we were building, in the world where nothing could go wrong. I wish I had known then that trust, even the most sacred kind, can be shattered in an instant. But then came the cracks. They started off small, barely noticeable. Little things that I pushed aside, convinced they were just part of life. After all, we were building our lives together. We were happy, right? It's funny how suspicion can creep up on you without you even realizing it. First, it was so subtle, almost imperceptible. I'd catch my husband looking at his phone in a way that felt different. He'd be quick to hide the screen when I walked into the room, a little too quick. But it wasn't anything I could put my finger on. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was me being paranoid, I thought. After all, we had such a solid relationship, such a strong foundation. Trust was everything between us. But the late-night outings began to pile up. He'd come home later than usual, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his. Sometimes when I asked him where he'd been, he'd brush it off with a simple excuse. Work or a late dinner with friends. I believed him, of course. We all have those nights, right? But something about his tone, the way he'd avoid my gaze, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then came the texts. They were always on his phone, always in the middle of the night, or when he was in the shower, or when he thought I wasn't looking. At first, I convinced myself that maybe it was work-related. He worked in a demanding field, and I trusted him. So what was the harm in it? But slowly, I started to notice the way his eyes would linger on his phone, the way his body language shifted when he received a message. It wasn't just about the words in those texts. It was something deeper. A change in him I couldn't quite explain. I asked myself, was I being paranoid? Overthinking it, maybe. But no, there was something there. Something wasn't right. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was like I could feel the tension in the air, even if I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. And yet I stayed quiet. I didn't want to be that person, the one who snoops, the one who doesn't trust their partner. I convinced myself it was just a phase. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just stressed, caught up in my own head. But then little things kept adding up. Small inconsistencies in his stories. His sudden need for privacy. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was something I couldn't ignore. That's when the psychological tension began to build, turning every little interaction into a potential red flag. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop. And yet, I kept pretending I didn't see it. I was torn. I didn't want to believe it. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore. What if I was right? What if my instincts were telling me something I wasn't ready to hear? And even worse, what if I was too late? I'll never forget the exact moment I found out. It wasn't some dramatic, over-the-top scene like you might expect in a movie. It wasn't a knockdown, drag-out confrontation. No, it was worse in its own way. It was a quiet, almost innocuous discovery. But when I stumbled upon it, everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the people I loved, came crashing down all at once. It happened late one evening. I was going through our closet, trying to find something for a church event the next day, when I noticed something strange. Receipt. Tucked into the pocket of his jacket. A receipt for a restaurant I didn't recognize. I wasn't looking for anything specific, But there was a nagging feeling in my gut that made me take a closer look. The date on the receipt was a few days ago, and my husband had told me he was at work that evening. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he had met with a client. Maybe it wasn't such a big deal. But then I looked closer and my heart sank. The receipt wasn't just for any restaurant. It was for a little private place that I knew well, a place I had once visited with my husband. But there was something else too, something that stuck out even more. There, written in the small, almost illegible handwriting at the bottom of the receipt, was a note. Name. The name of the priest. The same priest who had married us. The same man we had trusted so completely. The priest who had stood there in front of us, blessing our union with such conviction, such power, as if our love were sacred. I felt my legs go weak, the ground beneath me seemingly vanishing. I could barely breathe as the pieces started to fall into place. All the late-night outings, the secretive texts, the strange behavior, it all made sense now. But it didn't make it easier to accept. In fact, it felt like the entire world around me was spinning, unraveling, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I could hear the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears as I stood there, staring at that receipt, the words on the paper blurring in front of my eyes. It was like time had stopped, and all I could think was, how? How could this happen? How could my husband, the man I loved, the one I trusted above all others, be involved in something so devastating? How could the priest, the one man I looked up to for guidance, be part of the very betrayal that was shattering my world? I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to see the truth, but there it was, staring me in the face. My heart broke as I realized the affair wasn't just a mistake or a momentary lapse. It was an ongoing secret, one that had been hidden from me for who knows how long. And it wasn't just any affair. No, this was a betrayal of the highest order. The very man who had helped cement my marriage, the one who had stood in front of God to bless us, was now the one tearing it apart. At first, I couldn't even comprehend the enormity of what was happening. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't some fling or a one-time mistake that could be written off. No, this was something far worse, something that crossed boundaries I didn't even know existed. The priest wasn't just a trusted figure in our lives. He was the one who had symbolically guided us toward this perfect, ideal union. To discover that he had not only betrayed me but had engaged in a forbidden relationship with my husband, it felt like the ground had completely shifted beneath my feet. How could I make sense of this? How could I reconcile the man who had been a rock of spiritual support to us with the person who had turned our sacred vows into a sickening game? I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout and demand answers, but there was this deep, gnawing feeling in my chest, this realization that nothing about this situation made any sense. It didn't just shatter my trust in my husband. It shook my faith to its very core. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how wrong this was on so many levels. There was the obvious betrayal, the infidelity, the secrecy. But what about the deeper betrayal? The betrayal of the faith that we had built together, the trust that had been nurtured over the years. This was a betrayal that wasn't just between two people. It was between the sacred institution of marriage and the man who had promised to uphold it. And then, there was the moral dilemma I couldn't escape. Who had I become in this mess? The more I tried to process it, the more I felt like I was losing myself. I wanted answers. I wanted closure. But how could I ever forgive something like this? How could I even begin to understand what my husband and the priest had done to me? Was this some twisted form of love they had convinced themselves was okay? Or was it simply something darker, a hunger that couldn't be controlled? It was a love so forbidden that it left a permanent stain on everything it touched. What made it even worse was the fact that they had played me for a fool. They had lied to my face. The priest had stood there in front of me, preaching about faith, love, and honor, and now I knew the truth, that everything he had ever said had been a lie. This wasn't about love or faith. It was about something else entirely, something twisted and sinister. The betrayal felt even worse knowing that the priest had been the one to encourage us to trust in the sanctity of our marriage, when all along, he was betraying us both. It's hard to even put into words the sense of loss that hit me. It was as if everything I had believed in had been upended. My husband, the man I thought I knew, had chosen to engage in something that not only destroyed me but also destroyed everything we had built together. And the priest, the man who had married us, the man I had trusted with the very foundation of our relationship, was now a part of a scandalous, forbidden romance that I couldn't escape from. The pain of this betrayal was unbearable, and it wasn't just because of the affair. It was the realization that these two people, the ones I had placed the most trust in, had shattered the very core of everything I had ever known. The confrontation with my husband wasn't anything like I had imagined. I thought I'd be able to gather my strength, to stand tall and demand the truth. I thought I could be calm, collected, and in control of the situation. But when the moment arrived, everything inside of me just broke. It was as if the weight of the truth was too much to carry, and my entire body felt heavy with it. I confronted him in the living room that night, after I'd found all the evidence, texts, receipts, the names that had never meant anything before, but now felt like the hammer striking the nail in my heart. My hands were shaking as I held the phone up to his face. I could barely look at him as I asked the question I had been dreading. "What's going on?" He tried to play it off at first, acting surprised, acting as though he didn't know what I was talking about. But I could see the guilt in his eyes. It was there, behind all the excuses, behind all the denials. He couldn't hide it. His voice wavered. His breathing grew uneven. For a moment I thought he might actually confess, just come clean and apologize. But no, instead he did what I never expected. He tried to justify it. "Look, it's not what you think," he said. His words were so soft, almost pleading, but they didn't make any sense. "I never wanted you to find out like this. It's complicated, okay? It's not that simple." Complicated. Really. I felt my chest tighten as I tried to process his words. How was any of this complicated? How was a betrayal like this anything but the most straightforward form of dishonesty? I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him everything I had felt, how I had been deceived, how every moment I had spent believing in him was now a lie. But instead I listened. I listened as he tried to explain his actions, the reasons behind his affair with the priest. The whole thing sounded so rehearsed. He spoke about guilt, about feeling lost in his own life, about how the priest had been a source of comfort when he didn't know where else to turn. It was like he was trying to convince himself that what he'd done wasn't as bad as it seemed. I could feel the psychological tension building between us, the air thick with confusion, anger, and heartbreak. Every word he spoke made it worse. He had no remorse in his voice, no real understanding of the hurt he had caused. I thought he would at least admit to his actions with some shame, but there was none. Instead, he made excuses, downplaying the whole thing, like it was some temporary lapse in judgment, as if what he had done was nothing more than a harmless mistake. But it wasn't harmless. It wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal so deep, it felt like a stab to the heart. I couldn't stop the tears that fell, even though I told myself I wouldn't cry. But when the truth hit me, when I realized how far he had fallen from the man I once knew, I just lost it. The pain of the betrayal washed over me in waves, and all I could do was stand there, feeling utterly broken. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It wasn't just about what he had done with the priest. It was about the trust he had shattered, the love he had trampled on. And as the confrontation dragged on, I realized something even more painful. This wasn't just a betrayal of me, it was a betrayal of everything we had ever stood for. And that was something I didn't think I could ever forgive. The moment I stood face to face with him, in the very church where my husband and I had promised to love each other forever, I felt a strange sense of disbelief. How was this possible? How could the man who had blessed our union, The very person who had preached about faith, trust, and loyalty. Be the one who had torn everything apart. The priest stood there in front of me. His expression unreadable, but I could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes. The truth was, he knew this confrontation was coming. He knew what he had done, and now he had to face it. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. There was no point in pretending everything was okay. I walked straight up to him, and without saying a word, I showed him the same evidence I had confronted my husband with. The same texts, the same receipts. His face drained of color. He looked down, unable to meet my gaze. But even in his silence, I could feel the weight of his shame. It was almost as if the church itself was bearing witness to this betrayal. The stained glass windows, the altar, everything that had once been sacred seemed to mock me now. The very walls of this holy place had been the backdrop for the darkest betrayal of my life. "Father, how could you?" The words escaped me before I could stop them. My voice cracked, and I could feel the pain rising in my chest again. How could he, someone who had devoted his life to God, be involved in something so twisted? How could he betray not just me, but the very vows he had sworn to uphold? I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear them. He didn't respond right away. For a long moment, he just stood there, his hands clasped together in front of him, like he was trying to pray his way out of this. Finally, he looked up, and the words that came out of his mouth made my stomach churn. "It was never supposed to be this way," he said softly, almost as if he was talking to himself. "I never meant for it to go this far. Never meant for it to go this far." My anger flared up. This wasn't some accidental misstep. This wasn't a small mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated betrayal, and he was trying to downplay it as some sort of slip-up. I took a step closer to him, forcing myself to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. "Then why did you do it? Why did you lie to me? Why did you destroy everything?" He seemed to shrink under my gaze, as if he were a child caught in a lie. But his next words hit me like a slap in the face. I was lost. I was lonely. I felt like I had no one to turn to. And when your husband came to me seeking guidance, I didn't know how to help him. He needed me. We both did. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was he trying to make it sound like this was some kind of tragic love story? Was he seriously trying to justify his actions by saying they were both looking for comfort? I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tear him apart for betraying everything I believed in, everything I had trusted him with. But as I stood there, facing him, the weight of it all began to settle in. The priest wasn't just a man of faith anymore. He wasn't just the person who had united us in marriage. He was now someone I didn't recognize, a man who had abandoned his vows, broken the sacred trust of his community, and plunged us all into a scandalous mess that would forever haunt us. He had taken everything that was good and pure about our relationship and twisted it into something dark and unrecognizable. The more I looked at him, the more I realized just how devastating this betrayal was. It wasn't just the affair with my husband. It was the fact that I had trusted this man, trusted him with the most important moments of my life. I had put my faith in him, and he had repaid that faith with nothing but lies and deceit. For a moment I thought he might apologize, that he might beg for forgiveness. But no. Instead, he looked at me with a resigned expression, as if he had already accepted that what he had done was beyond redemption. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it didn't sound like an apology, sounded like an excuse. And in that moment, I realized that the trust one had placed in him had been broken beyond repair. I couldn't look at him the same way ever again. The ripple effects of the affair were far-reaching, touching every part of my life in ways I hadn't even imagined. What had started as a quiet betrayal in the shadows soon exploded into an all-out scandal, shaking the very foundations of everything I had known. First there was my family. I could feel the whispers before I even walked into the room. My parents, who had always been so supportive of my marriage, were now silent, unable to look me in the eye. My mother, who had always said marriage was sacred, now seemed torn between comforting me and blaming me. The guilt I felt, the sense of shame, it was as if I had done something wrong, as if my entire existence had been tainted by what had happened. But the worst part was knowing that my parents, the people who had always been my rock, now viewed me differently. Their eyes held the weight of judgment. Even when they tried to comfort me, I could see the subtle distance between us, the invisible wall that now existed because of what had been revealed. And then there was the church community. The place that had once been a sanctuary of peace and faith became a battleground of whispers, speculation, and judgment. The scandal spread like wildfire. I couldn't walk into the church without feeling the eyes of every parishioner on me. I could hear the hushed conversations, the pointed glances, and worst of all, the questions about me. About my marriage, my relationship with a priest, everything that had once been so sacred now seemed to be on display for public scrutiny. I had trusted the church. I had believed in the power of faith and community. And now I was left standing in the ashes of that belief. The priest who had once guided me, who had been there on my wedding day, was now the subject of gossip and disdain. And the man I had married, the one who had promised me a lifetime of loyalty, was now a symbol of betrayal. His actions a scandal that no one could seem to forget. Social media made it worse. People I had never even met seemed to have an opinion on my life. Comments flooded in from all sides, some offering sympathy, others offering judgment. Friends I had once trusted distanced themselves, unsure of what to say or how to act. Even the smallest interaction seemed laced with tension, as though my entire existence had been defined by a single scandalous affair. And then there were the strangers, those who had heard about the affair, who had heard the gossip, and who now viewed me through the lens of the betrayal. I became the object of their pity, their judgment, their curiosity. It was as if my entire worth had been reduced to a single event, a single betrayal, that no one could let go of. But amid all the whispers, the judgment, and the stares, there was something deeper, a psychological wound that I had to contend with. The betrayal had not only shaken my relationships with others, it had shattered my sense of self. How could I trust anyone again? How could I ever believe in love, in faith, or in my own judgment after everything I had been through? The emotional conflict inside me was unbearable. The more I tried to heal, the more the pain seemed to grow, feeding off the judgment of others and the rawness of the betrayal. I thought about leaving the community, about distancing myself from everything that had once been familiar. Maybe I could find a new place to live, somewhere far away from the memories and the constant reminders of the betrayal. But as the days went on, I realized that running wasn't going to solve anything. The emotional scar of the betrayal would follow me, no matter where I went. And even if I left, I would still have to confront the trust issues that now haunted every part of me. The fallout wasn't just about what had been done, it was about how it had torn apart the fabric of my life. My sense of security, my beliefs, my relationships. All of them had been shaken to the core. And as much as I wanted to move on, I knew that the damage had been done. There was no easy way out of this. I didn't know where to begin. One moment I was living a life that seemed perfect, full of love, trust, and security. The next, I was drowning in a sea of betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, about faith, it all felt like a lie. The emotional toll of the affair hit me like a ton of bricks, and I found myself struggling to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. At first, there was numbness, a strange, hollow feeling that seemed to swallow me whole. I'd wake up every morning with the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me, but I couldn't even bring myself to cry. It was as if my heart had been broken so completely that it couldn't even process the pain. The shock of it all left me in a kind of daze. I went through the motions of life, going to work, attending social events, interacting with people, but I felt like I was on autopilot. It was all a blur. But the numbness didn't last forever. Slowly, the emotions started to trickle in. Anger, shame, confusion. I would find myself crying uncontrollably, sometimes at the most random moments. It could be a song on the radio that reminded me of my wedding day, or a simple phrase someone said that triggered a memory. Every little thing seemed to bring the pain rushing back, and I couldn't escape it. The hardest part, though, was dealing with the trust issues. How could I ever trust anyone again? How could I let anyone into my life, knowing what had happened? I questioned every relationship I had, my family, my friends, my colleagues, and wondered if they were all just pretending, if they were hiding something from me. And as for love, well, love seemed like a distant memory. How could I ever let myself fall in love again after everything I had been through? The thought of opening myself up to someone, only to have them betray me in the same way, was enough to keep me up at night. But there was also a part of me that refused to stay broken. I had to rebuild. I had to heal. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but I knew I couldn't live in this constant state of pain. So I took small steps toward reclaiming my life. I started by focusing on myself. I began to engage in activities that I had once enjoyed, things I had forgotten about in the midst of the whirlwind of marriage and family life. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I went for long walks just to clear my head. Slowly, I started to reconnect with the person I had been before all of this, before the affair, before the betrayal, before everything had come crashing down. But emotional healing wasn't just about doing things for myself. It was about confronting the pain head-on, accepting that it was part of my journey, and learning how to live with it. I spent hours reflecting on the past, trying to understand what had gone wrong. What had I missed? Was there something I could have done differently? And as I dug deeper, I began to realize that while I couldn't change the past, I could change how I moved forward. I could choose to let this define me, or I could choose to use it as an opportunity to grow stronger. Forgiveness, however, was the hardest part. Could I forgive my husband? Could I forgive the priest? Part of me wanted to hate them forever, to hold on to the anger and the pain as a form of protection. But I knew that holding on to that bitterness would only continue to hurt me. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could change how I let it affect me. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending the betrayal hadn't happened, but it meant letting go of the power that anger and resentment had over me. It meant finding peace, even if it meant doing so on my own. And as I began to rebuild my life, I realized something profound. I was stronger than I had ever been. Yes, I had been broken. Yes, I had been betrayed. But I had also survived. And that, in itself, was something worth celebrating. I knew there would be hard days ahead. There would always be moments when the pain would resurface, when the memories would flood back in, and I'd feel like I was drowning all over again. But I also knew that I was capable of moving forward. And little by little, day by day, I began to reclaim the pieces of myself that had been lost. Just when I thought I had reached the darkest point, when I believed there could be no more twists, no more surprises, life threw me another curveball. I was still grappling with the pain of the affair, trying to rebuild my sense of self and figure out what came next, when I stumbled upon a revelation that left me completely dumbfounded. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday of all days. I had been going through some old photos, memories of a time when everything seemed perfect. I was searching for something to hold on to, something that could remind me of the woman I used to be before all of this chaos. As I flipped through a box of keepsakes, my fingers brushed against a small envelope, one I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity nudged me, and I opened it, expecting to find something innocuous, maybe a forgotten note or a ticket from a concert we'd attended. But what I found inside was nothing short of earth-shattering. It was a letter from the priest. The words on the page weren't just casual notes. They were intimate confessions, revealing that the affair had been ongoing long before our wedding day. It wasn't just a betrayal that had started after we were married. It had started before, when I thought we were still in the honeymoon phase of our relationship. The priest had been involved with my husband in a hidden affair for years, even before the vows were exchanged. I could barely breathe as I read the words. It was like a punch to the gut. How could I have been so blind? How could I not have seen the signs that something was off, that I had been deceived on a scale far beyond what I had imagined? The affair wasn't a recent slip-up or a moment of weakness. It was a carefully concealed secret, one that had been festering in the background of my life, poisoning everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and faith. What was worse was realizing that I wasn't the only one who had been deceived. My entire family, my friends, and even the people at church had been kept in the dark, all of us unknowingly living a lie. Everyone had believed the story we had been told, the story of a happy marriage, a couple who had found true love and were committed to each other and their faith. But in reality, we were all part of a bigger, darker story, a story of manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. This revelation sent me into a spiral. For a moment, I couldn't even comprehend the enormity of what I had just discovered. It felt like my entire world had been ripped apart once again, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered reality. The emotional tension I had already been living with reached a new level. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about a complete betrayal of everything I had trusted. My marriage, my relationship with the priest, and the very foundation of the life I had built. And yet, as the shock began to subside, a new question emerged. If my husband and the priest had been hiding this from me for so long, what else had they hidden? What other secrets were there that I hadn't discovered yet? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was unraveling a much larger web of lies, a dark secret that stretched back years and involved far more people than I had ever suspected. The psychological tension was unbearable. I was no longer just angry or heartbroken. I was terrified. Terrified of what else I might uncover, terrified of what it meant for my future, terrified of how this new revelation would impact everything I thought I knew about my life. The emotional conflict I felt was overwhelming. Should I confront them both with this new information? Should I expose the truth to everyone, letting the scandal spread even further? Or should I try to move forward, trying to salvage whatever dignity I had left and slowly build a new life away from the wreckage? In that moment, everything felt uncertain. The revelation was devastating, but it also opened up a new path, one that would require me to make difficult decisions, ones that could change the course of my life forever. I used to think that betrayal was a black and white thing, that once someone hurt you, there was no going back. But the truth is, betrayal is messy. It's complicated. And, as I've come to realize, it can be one of the most painful yet transformative experiences of your life. At first, I was consumed by the pain. Every time I thought about what had happened, I felt like I was drowning in it. I couldn't understand why it had happened to me, why I had been the one left in the wreckage. But over time, as I reflected on everything that had transpired, something began to shift within me. I stopped seeing myself as a victim, as someone defined by what had been done to me, and I started to see myself as someone capable of growth, change, and resilience. One of the biggest lessons I learned was the importance of setting boundaries. Before all of this, I had been so focused on being the perfect wife, the perfect daughter, the perfect person, that I had neglected my own needs and my own emotional well-being. I had given so much of myself to others that I had lost sight of who I was. Betrayal forced me to reevaluate everything. And one of the first things I had to do was learn how to say no when something didn't feel right. I had to learn that my peace of mind was just as important as anyone else's. And that's the thing about pain. It teaches you to prioritize yourself in ways you never thought possible. It forces you to confront the things that matter most. I had spent years putting others first, but after the affair, I realized I had been neglecting my own emotional health. So I began to make changes. I started saying no to situations that drained me, to people who didn't have my best interests at heart, to anything that wasn't serving me. And that was the beginning of reclaiming my power. Another lesson I learned was the importance of forgiveness. not for the sake of the people who hurt me but for my own sake. I'd spent months holding on to anger, letting it consume me. I had every right to be angry, to want to make them feel the pain they had caused me. But holding on to that bitterness was like drinking poison and hoping they would suffer. It was only hurting me. Forgiveness didn't mean I was excusing their actions or forgetting what had happened. It simply meant that I was choosing to release the hold that anger had over me. This wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But as I began to forgive, starting with my husband, then the priest, and eventually even myself, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't forgiving them for their sake, but for mine. I was reclaiming my peace, my power, and my future. It was a liberating feeling. And perhaps the most important lesson I learned was the strength that lies within us all. When life knocks you down, when you feel like you can't possibly go on, that's when you discover what you're made of. I discovered strength I didn't know I had. I discovered resilience in the face of heartbreak. I learned that I could survive, and even thrive, after the worst possible betrayal. I think one of the most powerful things I realized in the aftermath of all of this was that pain is a teacher. It doesn't come to break you. It comes to show you who you really are. It strips away the things you thought defined you and forces you to rebuild from the inside out. And while it's incredibly difficult in the moment, it's also incredibly empowering once you start to heal. It's been a long journey, but I've learned to see the betrayal not as the end of my story, but as a turning point. Yes, it hurt. Yes, it shattered my trust and my belief in the people I loved. But it also taught me how to rebuild, how to rise from the ashes, and how to become a stronger, more self-assured version of myself. I've learned to value myself in ways I never did before. I've learned to trust my instincts and to put my own well-being above all else. And most importantly, I've learned that no matter what happens, I will never be broken beyond repair. I am stronger than I ever thought possible. When you've been through something as life-altering as I have, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that your life is forever defined by the pain you've experienced. For months, I felt like I was stuck in a loop, reliving the betrayal over and over, wondering if I'd ever truly be able to move on. But as time passed, something inside me began to shift. The darkness that once clouded my every thought started to lift, and I realized that the life-changing discovery I had made wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. I had spent so much time focusing on the heartbreak, on the people who had hurt me, that I forgot about the one person I needed to care about the most. Me. I had been so caught up in the drama and the pain of the affair, in the moral dilemma of whether or not to forgive, that I had lost sight of what I really needed. And what I needed was to rediscover myself, to find happiness and peace within, rather than relying on anyone else to provide it for me. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But I began to take small steps toward healing. I started focusing on things that brought me joy. Simple things like reading my favorite books, taking long walks in nature, and spending time with people who truly cared about me. I realized that I didn't need to wait for anyone else to fix me. I could start repairing myself piece by piece, day by day. One of the most liberating things I did was stop feeling guilty for moving on. For so long, I felt like I was supposed to be stuck in the past, reliving every painful moment, replaying the betrayal over and over in my mind. But eventually, I realized that healing meant allowing myself to move forward, to create new memories, and to embrace a future that didn't include the people who had hurt me. As I focused more on my own well-being, I found that my faith, which had been shattered in the wake of the affair, started to slowly rebuild. It wasn't the same as it was before, and I wasn't sure it ever would be, but I began to trust again, first in myself and then in the possibility of a life filled with more hope and less heartache. I also realized that I didn't need to put all my trust in one person or one institution. Trust had to come from within, from knowing that no matter what life threw my way, I had the strength to overcome it. I also became more selective about the people I let into my life. No more pretending to be perfect. No more letting people take advantage of my kindness. I started setting clear boundaries and only allowing those who truly supported me to be a part of my journey forward. It was freeing, knowing that I had the power to choose who was in my life and who wasn't. I wasn't naive enough to think that everything was perfect from that point forward. Life doesn't work that way. But I did learn that it was okay to embrace a new beginning, to let go of the past, and to start fresh, without guilt or shame. I no longer needed to carry the weight of what had happened. I could start fresh, armed with the lessons I'd learned and the strength I'd gained from my experience. The truth is, no matter how devastating the past may be, there is always the possibility of a new beginning. It's easy to think that one mistake or one betrayal can define the rest of your life, but that's simply not true. You have the power to choose your next step, to rebuild your life in a way that feels authentic to who you are, and to create the future you deserve. So, as I look ahead, I feel a sense of hope. Hope that I can find love again, hope that I can trust again, and most importantly, hope that I am capable of creating a life that is built on my own terms, not defined by the pain of my past. In a way, the betrayal was a blessing in disguise. It shook me to my core, but it also opened my eyes to the possibilities that lay ahead. The path I walk now is mine and mine alone, and I'm no longer afraid to embrace it with all the hope and confidence I can muster. Let's be real for a second. What would you do if you found out the people you trusted the most had betrayed you in the worst way possible? If the foundation of your life, your marriage, your faith, your sense of security, was suddenly crumbling before your eyes? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. No matter how much you try to prepare for the unexpected, sometimes life throws you a curveball so shocking that it knocks you off your feet. And I'm not just talking about a run-of-the-mill betrayal here. This was a betrayal that reached deep into my soul, one that shook the very core of everything I thought I knew. Finding out that my husband was having an affair with the priest who had married us was beyond anything I could have imagined. It was a scandalous relationship, one that brought with it a devastating secret, and it tore apart everything I had built. But here's the thing. You can either let something like this destroy you, or you can choose to rise from it. You can let the pain and heartbreak consume you, or you can turn that pain into a lesson that shapes who you become. If you were in my shoes, would you forgive them? Would you cut ties and walk away from everything, or would you try to rebuild what was lost? It's easy to judge someone's actions from the outside, but when you're in the middle of the storm, it's a whole different game. The emotional conflict, the trust issues, and the moral dilemma are all real, and they don't have simple answers. So I'm asking you, what would you do? How would you handle a betrayal so deep that it forces you to question everything about your life? I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to decide whether to forgive or walk away? How did you rebuild after something so devastating? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if you're struggling with something similar, know that you're not alone. You have the power to rise above it, to find your strength, and to create a future that's yours to shape. And if you found this story resonated with you, be sure to follow and like this video so we can keep these conversations going. It's not easy to talk about betrayal and heartbreak, but the more we share, the more we grow.